to thank you all for coming out tonight to our, what we originally listed as our open house meeting for the Winter Hill planning series. We've changed it up a little bit, and what we're actually doing tonight is we're going to run back through the presentation and the slide boards that we presented on October 29th when we had a small but dedicated group here, and we have a different small but dedicated group here because we want to spread the word a little bit and get a little bit more feedback on what we had there. Typically what we do between the late charrette meeting and the open house meeting is we look through this pile and we look through the results and comments on it, and we try to shorten our list of priorities a little bit based upon the feedback we get and based upon what we determine is or isn't either from a financial or an engineering standpoint feasible. So we look for community feedback, financial feasibility, technical feasibility, and then we sort of start to bring back down ideas that we know can work, and from there bring them back in an open house. So what we're going to do is probably sometime in 6 to 8 weeks we will do another meeting. We'll announce another meeting, and at that meeting we're going to do that step. The open house is nice when we do it that way. That format will be a drop-in format, so you can come anytime through the evening and take a look at the plans that we've done and give us, see if we got it right and see if we do what we've done right. So the really interesting stuff, which is over here, is there's over 50 different pictures, drawings, ideas, maps, things that came up out of our October charrette that were our ideas that were generated there. And what we're looking for tonight is your feedback on all of those. A chance to look at what results came out of that meeting and say, hey, I like this idea, I don't like that idea, this is a great idea, this is not a great idea, and give us some feedback. So that's what we're here to do tonight, and look forward to the chance to have you all do that. My name is George Proakis. I'm Director of Planning for the city. I'm here with Brad Rawson, Senior Planner and Project Coordinator, and Sue Thomas, who is with our Economic Development team, who's been working with us on this project as well. Brad's going to give the majority of this presentation, and then he and Sue are going to help you through looking at what options exist here. I wanted to give just a little bit of background. How many people in the room here came to any of the Winter Hill charrette activities in October? All right, did any of you make it to the last meeting, the one I'm kind of somewhat doing over tonight? All right, great. One of you. Okay. What's that? The October 29th, the one where we've had all this stuff up. Oh, good. Okay. So October 29th, we had a good group to get feedback, and we're looking to get more feedback on that. So, well, how many of you were at the September meeting, the kickoff where we did the visions and the photos and stuff? Excellent. All right, great. And then the 27th, 28th, 29th, we spent most of those 3 days. Well, Brad will show you all the pictures and all the fun we had when we were there. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the focus on this. We have been focusing on implementing the Summer Vision Comprehensive Plan, which was approved in 2012 after 3 years of work. One of the key elements that came out of the Summer Vision Plan, and this was like all of the words that people brought up as their community priorities, was that we needed to make sure to do more detailed neighborhood plans on neighborhoods that needed specific, that we saw specific change was going to happen or change wanted to happen, and that we felt it was important to look at places that were going to change and figure out how they were going to change and what was going to occur there. Summer Vision, the key to Summer Vision is a map that talks about areas in the city to conserve, to enhance, and transform. It talks about transforming areas like Assembly Square and Innerbelt and Brick Bottom to make them completely different new neighborhoods, about conserving residential neighborhoods of 2-3 family houses and making sure those remain essentially very similar to the way they are today, and about enhancing neighborhood corridors and squares. So if you look at the squares like Gilman Square and Boone Square, each have the blue circle around them in the map, and Winter Hill along Broadway has a blue line along the map. For this particular study, we were looking at Broadway and Winter Hill. We're looking at the neighborhood around, and we were also looking around Mystic Ave and Foss Park and the area that's around there. The Summer Vision Plan is a plan. It's a combination of a growth strategy and a neighborhood preservation strategy. The growth strategy based upon the idea of bringing 30,000 new jobs, 125 new acres of open space, and 6,000 new housing units, of which a minimum of 1,200 are permanently affordable. Recently, the mayor has asked the Summer Vision Steering Committee to get back together and talk about whether or not we want to increase our housing numbers to 9,000 housing units and increase the affordable as well, because we've had these regional planning studies recently that have said there's a 400,000 unit housing shortage in the region. And if Somerville were to do its part, the best way to do that would be to do 9,000 housing units. And that's a pretty significant aggressive growth plan, but the key to making that work is making sure that in addition to having 50% of new trips by transit, bike, or walking, the idea is the vast majority of new development is in those areas to transform. Innerbelt, Brick Bottom, Boynton Yards, Assembly Square, the southern edge of Union Square, the far end of East Broadway by Sullivan Square, and that the other 15% of development is spread through, for the most part, through these enhancement areas like neighborhoods around Winter Hill, the Broadway corridor, the Mystic Ave corridor. So I'm going to turn this over to Brad, who's going to tell us a little bit about what we did as a neighborhood planning process, how we spent the charrette days in October, and go through. So it was a group of city staff and consultants that worked together through that time. We spent 3 days kind of in the neighborhood, in the space, the little old cell phone store there that you could step out of and walk up and down Broadway and get good feedback and see where things were going. And drew a bunch of different ideas, put these ideas together, tried to connect them with the streetscape work our transportation team was already doing, and put all of that stuff together and generate a whole bunch of concepts of what we could do, much of which are either in this some of which is in this presentation, but all of which is on those boards up there. So, Brad, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for taking the time on a nasty evening in the middle of the cold winter. My name is Brad Ross, and I live in West Somerville, and I work in the mayor's office under George, doing long-range participatory neighborhood planning. We all know that our community is changing, right? And I think that most of us, when we actually take a step back and think about it, we recognize that we either can try to guide that change, or we can perhaps have that change occur in spite of what we really want to see as a future for our community. And so the Somerville by Design process is really intended to bring folks into the conversation about where Somerville is going. We find that there's a whole heck of a lot of knowledge about what's working well and what's not working so well in each neighborhood, right? Folks who live in a specific part of town, people who work in a specific part of town or recreate there, are collecting constant information about blocks that feel walkable and safe, streetlights that are out, restaurants whose dumpsters aren't being properly emptied, vacant storefronts that seem to always fail and struggle to get filled again, right? And so what we've learned over the years, I've been part of the mayor's team for 7 years now, and I'm working with George for 5 years, we have realized that we can get the best community process and the best strategic plans for our community's future when we actually ask people about their experiences. And often that means asking what we call physical planning questions. Again, which sections of sidewalk are too narrow to handle the volume of pedestrian activity and support healthy street trees and provide opportunities for businesses to perhaps have cafe seating or have residents, living on their front porches and interacting with their friends and neighbors as they're walking by, looking out for one another, walking their dogs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All those kind of social dynamic questions. So we find that when we ask these questions, we tend to get good participation, great ideas, sometimes ideas that we wouldn't even have thought of in City Hall or in our travels. And so this is the model that we've been using. Winter Hill is the 5th neighborhood that we've used this methodology, and we're really, really excited about it. It's a constant evolution, and so again, when we see people coming out and participating, we're really excited. We want to honor everybody's time and respect this. So we're going to try to move really, really quickly through a series of ideas here that have been generated. Now, we saw a bunch of hands raised. Many of you have been in the room. You've been part of this process since September. You know that we start these neighborhood planning processes with a big map and a trace paper and say, which parks feel good? Which blocks have a vacant storefront that you wish is something else, right? And it's really important to put the magic markers in folks' own hands and let them see their own handwriting, right? As opposed to somebody else filtering or transmitting it. When people see their own handwriting, their own ideas circled back to them, I think it really strengthens the process and holds your public servants accountable, right? So we have dozens of these maps now. They get scanned, they get posted to the web. We learn a lot from the process. We had a great crowd back in September in this very room. And the second stage of the process is this multi-day charrette. This is really, really fun because not everybody can make a typical night meeting, right? So we offer 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. community engagement. We try to have a bit of a novel and exciting place to have these meetings. Sometimes a vacant storefront it actually is really, really exciting for people to go into. And again, it helps us as planners and as civil servants because then we're on the block. Here's an example. I never realized how loud and noisy the section of Broadway around Temple Street and Marshall Street is. So folks who live and work and commute through the neighborhood every day, I am amazed that you deal with the levels of noise that you do, the frequency of heavy truck traffic, right? Broadway actually serves as a bit of a regional truck pass-through. And those things are loud with their air brakes and their diesel engines. So it gives us an appreciation for the day-to-day experience of folks in the neighborhoods. We do all sorts of fun and funky things to try to draw people into the process who wouldn't be there otherwise, right? Sometimes that means creating temporary public spaces. We'll take over a parallel parking spot like we did on East Broadway 2 years ago. We'll have musicians play. We'll take over a city-owned parking lot for a couple of days in Davis Square a couple of years ago and have circus arts performers. The idea is to draw people in who otherwise either aren't on email distribution lists or really might not even feel comfortable getting involved in civic affairs. So when we create this kind of street life and novel feel, here's an example, the Somerville Arts Council's new art bus, where we are screening films and we are working with Somerville Neighborhood News to do testimonials about the good old days or the bad old days, whatever the old days were, right? Tell us your experiences about the neighborhood, things that you love. We were doing some video interviewing, and it's really, really fun. So a lot of folks are turning their heads and walking into to the studio space who wouldn't otherwise. 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., whether you're a first shift worker, second shift, third shift, whether you've got family responsibilities, whether you've got a long commute, this creates more opportunities for people to be involved in the dialogue. It's really, really important. So a schedule of topical events was arranged based on what we heard from you all earlier in the process. So for example, we would have a 1-hour session just on the economics of grocery stores, because obviously you all are telling us, and we've all known about the dilemma of having the Star Market closed. We would have a 1-hour session just on Foss Park, because we realized that as well used as that space is, it actually really could use some improvements. And so we wanted to drill down and give people the opportunity to dive deeper. So here you see a session on housing. And again, as George mentioned, there is a crisis in this region and in this city, and we wanted to make sure that folks had an opportunity to really dive deep into subject-specific material. Our team, our staff, our consultants, our community volunteers, we spend a lot of time walking the blocks, and again, we learn things that we wouldn't otherwise. The outputs of these processes and where we hope to be in Winter Hill in 6 months is to have a neighborhood plan draft. You can see a few examples from other Green Line neighborhoods where we've been doing this methodology, and these documents create a framework for public investment and private investment. If you're moving to the neighborhood, if you're thinking about starting a business, if you're thinking about buying a home, you're thinking about getting involved in civic affairs, here's a great starting place. It captures the community values and vision, and the Gilman Square and Lowell Street plans are great examples. And keep an eye out for Davis Square and East Somerville. They should be released for a public review draft over the next couple of months as well. So study area, very quickly. Winter Hill's a big neighborhood. I don't need to tell you folks that. Mystic Ave in the north, all the way down to Medford Street in the south, and Pearl Street we kind of determined as a boundary as well. And then of course the top of the hill, right? Magoon Square and Main Street, all the way down to Foss Park and McGrath Highway. We often think about walking distances, and if you set yourself up at the corner of Temple and Broadway, 5-minute walk will get you, obviously down past St. Anne's and City Hall Annex there. It'll get you up to St. Polycarp's Village. It won't get you all the way to the Healy School. That second circle represents roughly a 10-minute walk, about a half mile for most folks. But of course, the twists and turns of a strange street grid sometimes can make that a longer or shorter walk. George mentioned our streetscape project. We can never press pause and stop the world. We're fortunate to have funding support from our Board of Aldermen moving forward with some streetscape study. And so that project is underway. But this big picture neighborhood plan allows us to kind of set a larger framework. So here you see the limits of the Broadway streetscape corridor, right? It's really curb to curb on Broadway. But our neighborhood plan recognizes that Broadway can't function unless Mystic Ave works, right? That unless McGrath Highway is fixed, we will never have the great connections between Winter Hill and East Somerville that we all want. Here's a little diagram of one-way streets and thoroughfares. The big, thick blue lines are the streets that you all told us in our neighborhood mapping process are most important to you. And again, if somebody's sitting at City Hall and never gets out into the neighborhood, maybe you take Main Street for granted. A lot of folks who are participating in this process told us how important Main Street is for their day-to-day, for their week-to-week, and how that represents just as important an opportunity as school or Temple, right? Open spaces. Somerville is tremendously deficient in our open space. We've got some great parks. We've fixed up, I think, about 95% of them in the 12 years that Mayor Curtitone's been in office, but we need more. The Summer Vision Plan calls for almost doubling the amount of public open space in the city. And keep in mind, it costs about $1 million per acre. So 125 new acres of open space means a public or a public-private investment of over $100 million. That's an ambitious goal, but it's appropriate because these are not only the lungs of our community, but these are the places where we meet our neighbors, where our children learn. And one of the things that we see here when we map the civic spaces and open spaces in Winter Hill is there's actually a bit of a gap. So check out the difference between these two images. The gap is mostly around Temple, and so based on what we saw from our neighborhood mapping back in September, folks had drawn boxes on the Star Market property, Folks had drawn extensions of the surfaces here at the Healy. People had talked about the intersection at Temple where it doglegs by the entrance to the SHA. So are there opportunities to bring additional new open spaces that serve a diversity of users? We think so, and we'll get into some of those ideas specifically. So this part's going to start to feel really, really quick. And we'll obviously try to stop talking at you and pivot back to kind of the small group stuff because I think that that's an effective way for folks to ask questions and self-select to the topics that are most important to them. But economic development, ranging from the small business assistance programs that the city runs and is currently expanding, to the tenant landlord matching and all that sort of stuff that we do to try to fill vacancies at a place like Star Market, all the way to more real estate development oriented programs that would look for, say, daytime population in the form of office jobs on the upper stories of potential future redeveloped sites. So let's run through a couple of key pieces of information that our economic consultants out of Rochester, New York ran through for us. Winter Hill obviously is a dense neighborhood. We know that the neighborhood is changing. We'll upload this stuff, and so I won't bore you and read off numbers. But there are a lot of people here. People in the neighborhood represents spending power. One of the questions is, are people able to spend their money locally? Does the mix of goods and services support a healthy retail district? As you see from some of the historic photos, people would tell you that back in the 30s, the 40s, even in the 50s, and probably portions of the 60s, there was diversity of business activity here on the Broadway corridor, on Mystic Ave, even on side streets like Temple or Marshall. But obviously that's changed. The economics of the shopping mall era, the highway era, have kind of steered people towards other regional centers, and we see it's a very, very different economic case for mom and pop merchants on Broadway. But people still say they love that. They really want to be able to meet many of their daily and weekly needs in walking distance. So that's a key public policy theme for us going forward. How can we make sure that folks are having the choice to spend locally to support the merchants that they say they value in the community, right? Somerville's growing. We know that we're in the midst of a profound demographic shift where baby boomers are moving back to the cities around the world, around the country, and certainly here in Metro Boston, as well as young folks. People value walkability. That creates wonderful opportunities and tremendous challenges. And we don't have to, there's no risk of overstating the challenges of gentrification and neighborhood change, making sure that folks who have been here through thick and thin can benefit from all the great investment that's happening. Back when the Star Market closed, almost 10 years ago now, the city, prior to any lawsuits, the city had worked with the landlord and tried to find a good tenant, right? We do that from the smallest retail spaces to the biggest ones. And one of the really, really interesting things was bringing potential grocery operators into that space. And often folks would say in the community, hey, have you brought a Trader Joe's here? What about Demoulas? Can we get the space filled by one of the existing operators? All of them are using formulas, right? They're looking at certain demographic characteristics in the neighborhoods. And back in 2007, when the grocery store closed, the conventional wisdom in the community was the neighborhood demographics don't support grocery store operations. And one of the interesting things we learned from our economics consultants on this team was that's hogwash. There's plenty of purchasing power here, and folks can actually I think, make a business case for a neighborhood serving grocer in the neighborhood if you're just looking at the economic, the demographics and the spending, the income levels.
Maybe in 2007 that was the case, but it's not now.
It's possible, yeah. I think the bigger question is actually the format of that store. The size of it is kind of in between. It's kind of in the donut hole in the middle of efficiencies for different types of operators. But again, just kind of keeping moving forward here. Are there enough beds to support these things? Here's a grocery store analysis specifically that we thought was really, really interesting coming out of this process. The folks that we hired just started a community-oriented small independent grocer in Rochester, New York, in the inner city, in what we would think of as a food desert. And they kind of really helped us understand the way that a lot of these investors are making decisions. And they drew this map. So again, these are service areas of existing grocery stores, whether it's the Stop and Shop over in East Somerville, or Demoulas on Somerville Ave, or the old Johnny's now Stop and Shop, and then the Whole Foods down on Broadway Parkway in my neighborhood. There's a donut hole in Winter Hill, but the hole of the donut is not centered on Temple and Broadway anymore. The Stop and Shop over on McGrath and East Somerville has kind of captured a lot of what they would think of as the purchasing power along Temple, along Grant, and Wheatland, and the neighborhoods down on that side of the neighborhood. And so when they actually started running the analyses, our consultant said, well, There's good news and there's bad news, folks. Bad news is that the Star Market site isn't obvious as an attractive grocery site. The good news is a little bit west in Winter Hill, kind of on the Moon Square side of the district, might actually make more sense because it's currently underserved. And so they encourage the city to work with property owners and to work with potential tenants to say, are there the right spaces, because there is an underserved market on that part of the Somerville-Medford border. And there are a couple of sites that might be large enough to support a viable grocery store. We ran some real estate analyses at the Star Market site based on a community process back in 08, 09. There had been discussions about looking for more of a mid-rise building type that would provide incentives for the private owner to reinvest and redevelop. Private owners not taking advantage of those incentives. But again, we ran the numbers, and it seems like the project could be financially viable to provide a mix of apartments, retail space, community space, perhaps even structured parking, which is very expensive. So we've got a number of schemes that we can kind of show and illustrate how that new investment might look and feel if we ever break through and get there, right? So on to the fun stuff. This is the physical planning that I really started talking about earlier. So first study area, Mystic Ave, and we were so excited when everybody who came out to our session in September said, don't forget Mystic, don't forget Mystic. It's so easy to focus on Broadway with the kind of the historic commercial corridor, but we were able to take what people asked for and kind of really look at a few important connections, traffic calming, humanizing the roadway, recognizing its regional significance, but at the same time saying, hey, this is tough for folks who live here. It's tough for folks who do business here. We met many of the mom and pop business owners down on Mystic itself. And obviously everybody really wants to be able to take advantage of the wonderful resources of the Mystic River and get over to Assembly Square now. So what are the connections looking like? Here's one. Coming out of the SHA, kind of the front door of the SHA property into Shore Drive. And with relatively simple engineering solutions about extending sidewalks, altering curb lines ever so slightly, forcing cars and trucks to slow down, doing what we call shortening the crossing distance, all of a sudden you can provide, I think, an easier, safer, and more dignified connection for the thousands of residents in Winter Hill, not just in the SHA properties, but throughout the neighborhood, to get over to the boathouse on Shore Drive, right? So here's a quick scheme of how a humanized intersection might look. Perspectives, right? This is obviously a pretty rough visual environment. Again, it's noisy. The air pollution is a significant concern. The locally generated murals are wonderful in terms of humanizing the space and communicating our community pride, but how else might that feel with some of those public realm interventions? And again, we're not talking about giant, 10-year, $10 million interventions. We're talking about more modest scale improvements, lighting, paint, a couple curb changes. This is at the corner of Wheatland, and everybody in the East Somerville process 2 years ago, and many of you here in the Winter Hill process this year have said, again, the highway's a barrier, and it's not just the width, it's not just trying to cross it, it's also the feel, it's the darkness of it, it's the dinginess, it's the dripping water and salt and motor oil, it's the salt sheds that the state uses there, et cetera. And folks have encouraged us to think creatively, and it's very fun. In this kind of format, it doesn't take a lot of public investment to say to an urban design consultant or a staff person, hey, let's get a photo and let's sketch what it might feel like to try to bring that under highway space back to life, right? Here's a scheme that uses solar panel installations to shield the highway itself from the neighborhood. Is that appropriate? Is that healthy? Or what are the trade-offs associated with it? Does that leave us with a bit of a canyon feel at the same time as maybe helping our energy resilience? So there's a quick sketch. Here's a slightly more detailed perspective. A lot of folks have been doing great research in the community about the public health impacts of having 250,000 cars go down I-93 every day coming from the northern suburbs. We clearly do want to mitigate any air pollution coming off that highway, and vertical walls are one kind of scientifically proven way to do that. But do they humanize the space effectively? I'm not certain. So here's another example of a bump out. This is actually at Temple now. So that's kind of the edge of St. Polycarp's there. And here's what it might look like with, say, buildings, with makerspace, fabrication, light industry. American manufacturing is coming back, as the mayor likes to say. We have wonderful examples with Artisans Asylum, Greentown Labs, but also 100 other small spaces scattered throughout the city in some of our old industrial buildings. Can we build new buildings that are relatively affordable where people can rent for 10 or 15 bucks a square foot do prototyping, have that kind of arts and maker economy come to this part of Winter Hill. So Temple Street itself, let's keep moving quickly through these. Everybody knows, obviously, the kind of the funny geometry of that intersection and the heavy traffic it handles, and yet at the same time, the important connection under the highway over to Ten Hills. Here's a little bit up the hill, right, by the Haitian Church, and here's the very top of the hill. So cross sections, this is how transportation engineers think about this. Literally, what is the distance from curb to curb? How much space do you have, and how do you prioritize among sometimes competing and sometimes parallel interests of pedestrians, bicyclists, motor vehicles, delivery trucks, regional 18-wheelers. And so here we see some of the measurements, and we see that there's enough space for a couple of parking lanes at 7 feet each, a couple of bike lanes, bless you, 5 feet each, and a couple of travel lanes at 10 feet each. That's a pretty urban layout, and seems to also provide a good kind of screening for pedestrians on the sidewalk, and the opportunity for potentially healthy street canopy trees.
That's Temple?
Yes. A second alternative, and again, when you're doing this kind of planning, you have the ability to throw 100 ideas up very, very quickly and evaluate them in a comparative fashion. So here's a second alternative. What this does is have a much larger separated kind of buffer zone for bicycling with a 3-foot door zone, as they call it. The sacrifice, of course, in this case is 1 lane of parallel parking, kind of gets gobbled up and reprioritized to those other uses. So here you say 2 travelways, 1 8-foot parking lane, and then 2 bike lanes with 3-foot buffers. A third scheme, separated cycle track. Communities around the country and of course around the world are recognizing that for lots and lots of potential urban bicyclists, on-street lanes and sharrows will never ever be good enough. The only thing that will make people feel comfortable, no matter how young or old you are, how experienced you are, is what we call a grade-separated facility. So having some sort of curb line to actually separate the cars away from the bicyclists. We're doing this on Beacon Street right now, and you can see a couple examples in Cambridge as well. The city of Boston's moving in this direction. So here's, again, a reprioritization of space. In this case, we actually do retain a parking lane on one side, 2 11-foot travelways, a 5-foot planted buffer, and then a 10-foot cycle track. So 3 different ways to think about Temple Street, and again, the fun part is visualizing what it might look and feel like. And here's, again, kind of a relatively low impact alternative. One of the things that's really important to look at in this image is notice the difference with the fence line, the SHA property on the left side of the image, right? We'll go back. Fence right up against sidewalk, green space on the other side of the fence, but does anybody use it? Fence perhaps moves, does that become more a part of a public open space where somebody might be comfortable actually hanging out, letting the dog run a little bit, putting a picnic blanket down, potentially. Also notice the difference in front of the old St. Polycarp's Church. There's a plaza that is shown in orange that you can see there. We had talked about that earlier with our overall neighborhood open space layout. The road geometry might allow for reclaiming of some asphalt and dedication for public open space. So, Foss Park, same logic, right? We've got some great things happening in Foss Park. It's tremendously well used. The city has been advocating for control from the state DCR for far longer than the 7 years that I've been here, and we do hope that this process will help us break through. We've shown that with Conway Park on Somerville Ave and Dilboy Stadium over in West Somerville, that the city can be more responsive to our residents' and users' needs and help the state get the operational costs and maintenance off of their books, right? So you can see an old historic postcard blown up on a poster over there. It used to be called Broadway Park before Foss Park, right? There was a large pond. It was very characteristic of a lot of the landscape architecture trends back in the late 19th century. Meandering paths, curved the linear paths we call them, and a pond that froze for skating. We also found some old historic photos, literally of kids in bathing caps, like swimming in this pond in the summertime. Yeah, we've got a pool today, but this kind of interesting, almost wilderness-style park would be a very different feel than it is today. Can we have it both ways? Can we serve the active recreational uses and the folks who are just looking for more of a passive, contemplative space? Foss Park is 14 acres. It is the largest single open space in Somerville. And so we really do need to make sure that it works for everybody and that the connections across it and through it really lend itself to, I think, a sense of utility, safety, and pride. So here's one quick alternative that was drawn on, during the charrette in the vacant storefront there. People talked about performance space, whether band shells can be integrated. In this scheme, we see 2 of the baseball diamonds retained but reconfigured We see the soccer pitch realigned to run north-south instead of east-west. Perhaps there's an opportunity for artificial turf to be discussed, because we all know how well used it is and how difficult it is with that playing surface there. There's barely a blade of grass, right? What's also really interesting about this sketch that you'll see in the second one is the east-west axis of pedestrian kind of connections. Lots of folks do want the opportunity to walk over to East Somerville and to the Stop and Shop, but it's actually between fencing and between some of the playing field uses, it's not as great a walk. And so can you line up the fact that Jake and Blakely are more or less on an axis and create a high quality promenade for folks to traverse the park east-west? Here's one alternative, right? The pool's retained, there's some bump outs down on Broadway, and so this is an interesting idea for Foss Park. So how about the southern end of Foss itself? We have often heard folks say the parking area itself is owned by DCR and then it kind of bleeds into the right-of-way of Broadway. Can that be used for an additional acre of public open space somehow? Can more programmed recreation space be part of the solution set, right? We actually don't have that many community uses. I was laughing with the after-school program folks here earlier today, and we were talking about how on every night of the week, in every gym, in every cafeteria, in every library in the city, it seems like there are multiple user groups. And so again, every conversation we have in every part of the city, people say, community space, interior four-season community space. The Armory is providing some of that in Spring Hill. That's wonderful. Are there opportunities here? And so this shows, for example, a YMCA or a Boys and Girls Club, some type of nonprofit, youth-oriented user creating built space at the southern end of Foss Park in a way that kind of, I think, interfaces well with the park potentially. These are just kind of quick sketches. And you also see some more real estate development and park space along the corridor. We'll come back to some of that. So here's the straight overhead. Keep in mind that Broadway, it really does reach its widest right around Wheatland, right around Walnut. It's more than 100 feet across. The average travel lane is about 10 feet, maybe 11 feet, right? So is the center median with its old growth trees the best use? Maybe. Is the geometry of the roadway appropriate? Can we repurpose and serve more user groups with that tremendous, tremendous asset? Here is a sketch that came out of the East Somerville process 2 years ago, focusing on connecting Foss Park over to East Broadway. And so, whether or not this is realistic from a financial engineering standpoint, as George was talking about, may or may not be the case. This feels a little bit like Huntington Ave in the South End and that part of Boston, but making sure that there are clean and safe connections from Winter Hill to East Somerville. So kind of keep that in mind as we look at some of these solutions for Foss Park. This is a really complicated sketch with a whole heck of a lot going on to it. On the east side, obviously, we've got Foss there. In the middle part, you can see the fire department is labeled, the headquarters there at Walnut. The large orange building in the left side of the image is the Star Market, the existing floor plate of the vacant Star Market. And then over in the top left is the existing footprint of the Rite Aid. And so any of the red buildings are ideas for potential new buildings to, again, kind of humanize the space, bring more vitality and activity, whether it's in the form of mixed use, apartments, retail, community space. And so again, there's a lot of land in this area potentially just by reclaiming old rights of way or surface parking lots. We also see a green space shown on the privately owned Star Market parking lot. So a lot going on in this image, and we can talk through the details with the boards here. Just in the interest of time, we'll keep moving. Uh-oh. Come on, computer. Here is a slightly different geometry of potentially a community center or YMCA type facility dovetailing with Foss Park, and then a much larger center media on Broadway, right? So look at the way it interfaces with the intersection at Fellsway West and really separates the eastbound traffic from the westbound to create potentially, almost like a Comm Ave style usable green space in the middle of the right-of-way. Is that desirable? Is it realistic to assume that people would actually use that space for picnicking, for walking, given some of the other transportation needs? These are the kind of questions we want you to be kicking around and help us kind of think about. So the streetscapes itself is a far cry from what it was 70 years ago. This picture is from the early 30s, and some of the buildings you'll recognize. In distance, we see the apartment building right at the corner of School, with the kind of the vertical or the horizontal bands. The Capitol Theater sign, folks who've been around the neighborhood longer than I have can tell stories about when Capitol was still open. That was up until the early 70s, I believe. But look at the rhythm and density of the street wall. Look at the number of commercial spaces that were on that corridor now, and compare it to what we see today, right? Where you mostly have surface parking lots. All right. Looks like I have to go back to a different file here. We recreated that photo, and it's a fun one to show. Taking that old historic snapshot and kind of overlaying it with what you see today. Just bear with me for one moment, forgive me. This is definitely an office laptop from the Clinton administration, probably is ripe for replacement. All right, so, again, thinking about the activity of a street wall, of a diversified set of uses along the Broadway corridor, you'll see a number of schemes, and again, this stuff will be familiar from browsing the boards earlier. Can new buildings or reimagined buildings be used to kind of humanize some of that space? That really does feel like a regional automobile cut through. Here's the historic photo, and here's the recreated image. So you see, essentially the Elizabeth Peabody House on the right at the corner of Fells Way. And look at the shop fronts and the awnings on both sides of the street. If that is desirable, there are public policy approaches that can be taken from a capital planning or from a regulatory or a business development standpoint to kind of bring us back to that kind of urban environment. And obviously there's our existing condition, some great local businesses, but then also some really difficult, I think, visual cues, like a giant blank wall at the old grocery store. Now, quick show of hands, who has been involved in the streetscape meetings? We've had a couple of them here as well, right? We are displaying these role plans over in the charrette space. These are end-to-end Magoon Square to Foss Park ideas. And again, it's just like our exercise that we just went through with Temple Street, prioritization of space, recognizing that there are pinch points up at Main Street and at the top of the hill, and there's much more width down at the bottom of the hill by Foss Park. One of the really, really interesting things is that the consultant's report from these initial ideas that were generated does acknowledge that the same amount of space is dedicated to automobile traffic, and there are alternatives essentially for the way the sidewalks feel and function and the bike facilities. So there are 3 concepts. You can find them all on the web. If you're not kind of aware of them, we can talk through them in more detail at your leisure. The consensus from the conversations that we've had with residents and business persons in the neighborhood is that everybody's saying that the second concept is the most bike friendly. And we often, again, challenge people to say, what is the hierarchy of need? What is the priority from a public policy standpoint? Here's an example from the city of Chicago where they spell it out very, very clearly. Our top priority is the most vulnerable user, the most dependent user in some ways, the pedestrian, then the transit rider, then the bicycle, then the automobile. Here are the multimodal connections around the neighborhood. Again, we're going to upload this presentation if it's not already, so you can browse this at your leisure. There's a huge difference in terms of traffic safety, cars moving 20 miles an hour versus 40 miles an hour. If you are struck by a moving vehicle at 40 miles an hour, the odds are not in your favor. 9 out of 10 pedestrians in those kind of collisions do not survive. However, at 20 miles an hour, 9 out of 10 do survive, right? 30 miles an hour is a bit of a break point. 50% survive. So often what we are talking about is designing traffic facilities, designing roads and the private properties abutting roads to send visual cues to drivers to drive at 25 miles an hour in an urban environment, 20 miles an hour even if they can in a tight street, right? So keep that in mind. The average speed was 27, not too bad. But obviously some people do treat this thoroughfare as a drag strip. And just in the 3 days that we were on site, we took a lot of readings, and we did catch some people going 40 miles an hour. Sound levels, again, we kind of collect this data. It's good to know. As I mentioned, it's pretty loud out there when the trucks are rumbling through. So here are these cross sections. One of the really interesting things about this image is, look how much almost excess space there is for the two vehicles represented in the middle. It's very unclear on certain parts of Broadway whether you're in a one-lane or a two-lane condition. And so this is one of those sections kind of at the top of the hill and even coming down towards Magoon, right, where if somebody doesn't know that street, it is very unclear to them whether they're expected to merge or not. I've been living here 7 years, like I've said, and it's still sometimes I get caught by surprise in the wrong conditions and wonder about merging myself when I'm heading westbound over the hill. Repurposing the space. Here's an example where the bicycle facilities get shunted into the middle of the right-of-way, and you retain on that section one much more clearly defined travelway in each direction and parking on either end. And keep an eye on the sidewalks as we walk through these alternatives as well. I think this is the existing condition sidewalk. The streetscape project that's going forward right now is looking at this. Cycle tracks separated by a curb on either side of the street. And we've heard some interesting perspectives from people who talk about the challenges of bicycling uphill, right? Whether this would actually make it much more comfortable and predictable. As we've heard in Beacon Street, there are plenty of driveways, plenty of side streets, and it would be interesting. I think one of the conversations that's happening with the streetscape team is, are there benefits to an alternative that actually puts both of the directions of bicycle travel on the same side versus on different sides? So here's the concept two that folks seem to be gravitating towards for the moment. I think I've got one more diagram of putting them both up. This is a center median, existing conditions, right. So this is now in the kind of the core of the district around Temple, around Main. The preferred alternative that folks are looking at, one bike facility on either side, and more or less status quo in the interior. Here's an alternative. Cycle track and bike lane, extra wide medium, right? Again, there's 100 different ways to kind of slice this apple. Main Street, we talked about that. Folks asked us to draw some specific ideas. Here's one that essentially has a raised table plaza to really humanize that space. There are bus stops there. There are strong desire lines for folks crossing the street. Can different pavers and kind of pinch points be used to signal traffic? Watch out, be careful. This also creates dedicated plaza space for either merchants on the commercial block or for residents and pedestrians on the south side there. I realize that this is a long presentation, so I'll try to keep moving as quickly as I can. Existing conditions, driveway curb cuts, 16% of the corridor, 37% of the frontage is parking lots. Again, this sends signals to drivers. This is a place to drive fast. It sends psychological signals to pedestrians. This is not a place to hang out, right? It's a place to move through, not to move to. Plenty of facades that are in need of upkeep, whether it's blank brick walls or broken signs and awnings. Where are the redevelopment opportunities? Folks who marked up their trace paper maps back in September, rightly highlighted the Star Market property, the Walgreens site, the post office block, the space where the charrette was, some of the properties down on Mystic Ave, and one or two on the east side, the southeast side of the district. So here's the Walgreens. The Brunello site obviously has struggled, existing condition. We were pretty excited to find this old image, and we've got a blown up version. Does anybody remember when the automobile dealer was here? And we were wondering how much of the building was reused and repurposed. And it seems that the frontage now where Winter Hill is, where the bank is, the loan center, it was kept, right? That the entire building wasn't demolished and redeveloped, that they actually figured out a way to selectively remove portions of the building and retain and reuse others. So that's just kind of a fun anecdote from history. Here's an alternative that retains, I think, the best parts of the existing block, which is that frontage, the buildings that come right up to the street, like where the loan center is right now, as opposed to the more suburban setback pieces like Brunello and like the Walgreens. Using the buildings to send cues to pedestrians. This is an interesting place to walk and to drivers to slow down. Can connections be made, to get cars into the site, potentially do even garage parking? And we did look at a couple of different layouts. if and when private property owners were ever interested in redevelopment. These types of ideas help reduce risk for them, but it also gives our residents an opportunity to evaluate them and say, hey, have you thought of this? This would be our preference if it ever comes to that, right? Structured parking as opposed to surface parking, for example. And so here's a little sequence, right? Existing condition, alternative number 1, and that's essentially with the current zoning, and alternative number 2, 4-story and 5-story. 5 years ago when the community process and the rezoning was put in place, there was some back and forth with folks in the neighborhood about whether 4 or 5 stories is the appropriate height. There's a classically designed 4-story apartment building right next door. The reason this one looks higher is that the ground floor is retail. Retail needs higher ceiling heights, right? So, but again, you put these ideas down and you allow folks to tell us what we got right and what we got wrong. The south side of the block, the post office, the Citizens Bank, the Bradford condos. People have said, this is a really, really odd configuration. It is not a walkable location. It is not particularly attractive or vibrant. Obviously, the landlords at the old Metro PCS have struggled to fill that space. So would redevelopment ever make sense? Because of the location of the Bradford condos, which you can see at the bottom of the boxy building in the rear, you got to have vehicle access there, right? They've got deeded parking. And so the idea of a rear alley or lane connecting from school over to Marshall in the east is probably the only way that ever happens in a realistic and desirable way. That's a lot of stakeholders to pull together. My understanding is that folks who live on Bradford had suggested that was not a great idea 10 years ago. And so it's fun for us to draw these ideas and just kind of make sure that if and when people's perspective changes, we have a way to have an informed conversation about it. So if something were to change and happen, maybe the first step is the Metro PCS building itself changes. It can be redeveloped as is. Interesting. Maybe viable, maybe not. If you were able to get an alley or a rear-loaded street, then all of a sudden you've got, I think, surface parking that can be reclaimed. And so we see, detached, kind of almost triple-decker type housing that could continue the rhythm of these detached multifamily homes on Bradford. And then at the same time, you've got opportunities for more traditional mixed use and infill buildings, as well as high-quality civic space in a couple different locations.
Brad,
right?
is that showing the road going all the way through?
It does, yes. But again, there are businesses, right? We were excited to be meeting Mona Lisa's for a couple days straight as we were in the neighborhood, and we recognize that some folks are doing just fine, and maybe this is a 25-year plan as opposed to a 5-year plan. The Star Market, existing conditions, the Rite Aid, the liquor store, the salon. It was fun meeting some of the merchants who operate those businesses. Here's a quick alternative, a pop-up community use, what we call pavement to plaza on the existing parking lot. We did this kind of stuff in Davis Square for our charrette a year and a half ago, and it was amazing to see how quickly these spaces filled up. All you have to do is put some cheap folding chairs and tables into a public parking lot, and people will flow out of the neighborhood, sit down, bring their strollers, bring their bag lunch. We brought food trucks in this case because this was the east side of Davis Square, and it was amazing to see folks coming out of the office buildings and just hanging out. So we think the same thing might be possible as an interim step on the Star Market site. There is an organization, it's an industry leader in these kind of lighter, cheaper, quicker, tactical interventions, they call them. That's part of our team called Team Better Block. And they encouraged us to think about some of the events and programming that we've used successfully in other parts of the city. Everybody loves the Summer Streets series. Can some of that type of repurposing in a temporary fashion be brought to Magoon Square or be brought down to the edge of Foss Park, right? These are temporary, low-cost things that just get people out of their cars, out of their houses, interacting with their neighbors for a day or two here and there. Here's a temporary example of Main Street becoming more of a plaza, right? This is a little bit like Wilson Square down on Somerville Avenue near the car wash. The folks at Team Better Block also encouraged the city to think about its regulations for starting and changing small businesses, for starting and changing signage or lighting or windows on retail spaces, cafe seating. Right now we have a tremendously onerous process of permitting to get these kinds of things going. And so they have talked about how around the country, often successful retail and kind of street-oriented cafe districts often require fundamental changes to permitting, licensing, and zoning. And so part of the city's overall zoning reform package that's public right now, you can find on the web, deals with some of these questions. Just getting government out of the way when we are essentially looking at things that everybody tells us that they want. biking, right? It's not just the north-south connections, it's also the east-west. Okay, what is the role of Jake and Heath? What about Marshall? The school's plenty wide, but Marshall is an important desire line as well. And, I remember, I think the first year that we did Summer Streets back in, say, 2010 or 2011, we had extended all the way up here to the corner of Temple, but we haven't really since. Is 2015 the year that we bring the Summer Streets program back to this part of Winter Hill? If folks advocate for it, I'm sure the mayor and the Arts Council would be excited to do so. Even absent a big curb line change and a multi-million-dollar streetscape project, we have the ability to humanize that intersection of what we're calling Temple Square. Quick paint jobs and temporary extensions of sidewalks can create a more human environment. Here's an example of Union Square, right? The folks from Team Better Block worked with us down there last year, and we just laid down these little strips to create a temporary crosswalk in front of Mike's Auto and the Community Access Television, where there's this huge demand and desire line to get across the street, but you either have to walk up to Prospect or walk back to Bow to get your safe crosswalks. So the same thing is obviously possible at Temple. So here's the existing condition, artist rendition. There's plenty of space on that Broadway, on that Star Market site. Private owner could do a bunch of different things if they wished, right? And so here are just a couple of different site plan alternatives. As you see, you mask the parking, you get some revenue producing buildings there, new apartments, new jobs, potentially if it's upper floor office, if that's viable, and you retain a bunch of the parking. Different schemes and ideas, and again, I'm just going to keep moving, so forgive me. How might it feel instead of having a giant 200 linear foot parking lot greeting you when you kind of come up Marshall? Here's one alternative, right? Different site plans, you can do a whole bunch of different stuff depending on the feel that people are looking to achieve. Could a high quality green space be integrated where instead of a parking lot, you've got actually a green space or a plaza that's framed by buildings in a very urban fashion? So we did a couple of studies and you'll see perspectives on that. So now we're looking back east. So here's a revitalized Star Market site that keeps the liquor store building, but then brings infill onto the parking lot. Could it be vital? Could it be attractive? We think so. I think the Metro PCS is visible on the right, and then the post office building is retained as is in the mid-rear right. And again, 100 different variations here. One of the really important questions, I think, is interior streets on the Star Market site. Would you ever want to try to connect Broadway to Sewell? What would be the trade-offs associated with that? Could that relieve some of the pressure on Temple? Would it really undermine quality of life for the folks who live in the neighborhood up on the north side? But again, that's the value of these quick sketch processes. Here's a quick sketch for Marshall Broadway. We've got some more finished stuff that we'll show in a moment. So again, this is Temple, you can see there, and then Marshall, and using a new public space there with one-way internal streets for the public. Alternative two-way streets. Here's a perspective of having that new green. So now we're looking south towards the post office building, essentially. So again, 100 different variations, perhaps reclaiming some of those surface parking lots that are down on Sewell below the retaining wall for infill housing. The site is large enough that, under the right development circumstances, structured parking might make a lot of sense. You can kind of justify the cost of it. And so this study showed a couple hundred parking spots in a garage underneath future buildings and public space. All right, so again, these are the, kind of the really exciting images where you can kind of compare before and after. And so here we're now, Cambridge Health Alliance is on our right. We're looking north at the corner of Marshall to the right aid. You can see that there. Under existing zoning with well-designed classical architecture, here's what you might expect. We think that could be an interesting solution. And also notice the public space that's visible on the right side here, right? So the second building's set significantly back, and you have a kind of a rectangular plaza there. You can also get rid of one of the buildings altogether and have a larger public space. You can shift your public space to the south side of the corner of Marshall, but again, recognizing that is currently a one-story retail block that is doing okay. So here's a kind of a full drawing that knits together several of these different ideas. So we're bringing it on home. Thanks for bearing with me. I realize that this is a long kind of presentation to sit through. When we did this 3 months ago, We had our economics consultant, we had our team better block consultant, we had our lead designer, and George, so the presentation was broken up in a little bit more of a rhythm. So existing condition, right? Alternative number 1, use the existing zoning and build vertical, just to a kind of mid-rise, 4-story kind of product, ground floor retail, upper floor probably apartments, maybe some community space or office space if there's a market for it. But again, focus on the large plaza here. So this is Temple, right? And so this concept does not include the existing liquor store building and salon building. And we had some interesting conversations with the folks who own and operate those properties. And they said, hey, we want to see these sketches. We want to have information as we plan for our own financial future. So this one has a large public plaza. This one either retains the existing building and brings in a smaller one, or reimagines both, and then has half the plaza size. So before we kind of get into small group conversation and filling out forms at your leisure, you can see the entire film presentation from City Cable on the web here. If you go to the Somerville by Design website and you find the Winter Hill pages, you'll see a link to high quality video footage of George, Russ, who's our lead designer, and the folks from our other consulting team members. So that kind of jog your memory. You can take these survey forms and fill them out at your leisure and email them back or drop them off. You can send us individual emails. You can call 311 and get patched through to me. The important thing here is anytime that you have one of those moments where you're on the block when you're at home and it occurs to you, oh my gosh, did the team think of this? I have a specific idea about Foss Park. Or wait, what about Marshall Street Playground? I didn't hear Brad talk about Marshall Street Playground. What's going on with that? Just reach out to us. Send an email. Use the blog functionality on the Somerville by Design page and get a little bit of a blog thread going and say, hey, some of these ideas are really cool, but what's going on with Marshall Street Playground? What's going on with the old, the flooring building there and then the church on Marshall? Nobody thought of that. I think that's an important part of the neighborhood's future. We want this to be an interactive and iterative process. And we are at the stage right now where we haven't sunk a tremendous amount of resources into this. As many drawings as this is nothing like the level of engineering required to go get the $10 million funding that was required for the East Broadway streetscape. We're not there yet. Now is the time for folks to give us their opinions on what ideas have merit, what ideas should be thrown away, and which elements of each should be cherry-picked and mashed together in a much more true feasibility study. So again, the neighborhood's changing, all from the small business mix to the housing prices to the public spaces. We want you all to give us the specific and physical ideas that are tied to specific locations to say, hey, as the neighborhood changes, prioritize this. Let's dedicate our limited time and resources to fixing this problem or addressing that challenge. So thanks for bearing with me. I'll be here at least for the next hour, so feel free to grab me and have as many conversations around these boards as you want. Fill out those survey forms and drop them. Fill them out at your leisure and send them back to us. And again, we'll be back in the neighborhood in another couple months from now. So thank you for coming out on a cold night, and please stay tuned. Thanks.